Steve? Steve? I have a question. I have a question. Wait, come over here. You don't have to come up. You know, I took off my cover from my video, and then I forget what I have to do to start the video, but because it just has my name on there now.
If you go to the
bottom,
you're at the bottom
left.
You know, yes.
Okay, start video. Okay, thanks. Okay.
To be here. Right, it's recording in progress. I'm so pleased to be here today and to give this talk on Virginia Woolf's reparative ethics. Thank you, of course, also Amy, for organizing such a wonderful conference. I would have loved to have met you all in person, but this will be a good second best. Now, okay, got it. There we go, recording. Okay, so I will begin by sharing my PowerPoint presentation, if I can do that. Yeah. Virginia Woolf's reparative ethics. Is the light bothering you in the background? I was trying to get that wonderful Zoom background you sent, Amy. There's a lamp behind my head, but okay, we will have to make do, I think. So, in her 1997 essay, Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick describes two modes of reading literature and the world at large, what she calls paranoid and reparative critical practices. She uses the term paranoid to describe a dominant reading mode that seeks to expose structural violence and oppression and to gather information about their operations and consequences. Writing at the turn of this century, Sedgwick wonders why this critical practice has become a mandatory injunction rather than a possibility. And I cite Sedgwick, in a world where no one needs to be delusional to find evidence of systemic oppression, to theorize out of anything but a paranoid critical stance has come to seem naive, pious, or complacent. I myself have no wish to return to the use of paranoid as a pathologizing diagnosis, but it seems to me a great loss when paranoid inquiry comes to seem entirely coextensive with critical theoretical inquiry, rather than being viewed as one kind of cognitive affective theoretical practice among other alternative kinds. The essay opens with a report from a conversation with a friend, activist scholar Cindy Patton, about the widespread speculation that the HIV virus had possibly been engineered or spread deliberately. Any of the early steps in its spread could have been either accidental or deliberate, Patton said. But I just have trouble getting interested in that. I mean, even suppose we were sure of every element of the conspiracy, what would we know then that we don't already know? Patton's comment suggests that for someone to have an unmystified, angry view of large and genuinely systemic oppressions does not intrinsically or necessarily enjoin that person to any specific train of epistemological or narrative consequences. To know that the origin or spread of HIV realistically might have resulted from a state-assisted conspiracy, such knowledge is, as it turns out, separable from the question of whether the energies of a given AIDS activist intellectual group might be best used in this tracing and exposure of such a possible plot. They might, but then again, they might not. Though ethically very fraught, this choice is not self-evident. Whether or not to undertake this highly compelling tracing and exposure project represents a strategic and local decision, not necessarily a categorical imperative. As a complement and alternative to the paranoid imperative, Sedgwick posits the jointly cognitive and affective practices, theoretical, activist, but also literary, that she calls reparative. Here she follows Melanie Klein's theory of reparation as a creative and ethical process emerging from a lifelong oscillation between paranoid and depressive positions, where the first is characterized by an acute alertness to threats, that's the paranoid position, while the second is a site of intellectual creativity. So one more Sedgwick quote. She writes that the depressive position is an anxiety mitigating achievement that the infant or adult only sometimes and often only briefly succeeds in inhabiting. This is the position from which it is possible to turn to one's own resources to assemble or repair the murderous part objects. And here I've inserted my own explanation of this, the part objects of which others in the world are perceived to be composed in the paranoid position. So the idea is that we repair these part objects into something like a whole, though I would emphasize not necessarily like any pre-existing whole. Once assembled to one's own specifications, the more satisfying object is available both to be identified with and to offer one nourishment and comfort in turn. Among Klein's names for the reparative process is love. It's probably more usual for the discussions of the depressive position in Klein to emphasize that position inaugurates ethical possibility in the form of a guilty, empathetic view of the other as at once good, damaged, integral, and requiring and eliciting love and care. Such ethical possibility, however, is founded on and coextensive with the subject's movement towards what Foucault calls care of the self, the often very fragile concern to provide the self with pleasure and nourishment in an environment that is perceived as not particularly offering them. For Sedgwick, to read literature reparatively is to engage with texts as sources of pleasure and positive affects that make possible a form of anxiety-reducing self-care. The political aspirations of such practices, the hope that art and literature can help mend the broken world, are routinely dismissed by the paranoid imperative, either as conservative or as naive or unrealistic. But Sedgwick maintains that reparative reading is indispensable for critical thinking and deep knowledge about ourselves and socio-political developments, including but not limited to the infliction of and exposure to systemic violence. She implies that both are vital critical modes, but only a reading from a paranoid position produces a limited worldview where cycles of geopolitical global violence seem bound to reproduce themselves endlessly, thereby foreclosing any hope for a more livable future. The complex ethical choice Sedgwick describes, whether to seek to know and make known the mechanisms and likely consequences of oppression and violence, the paranoid imperative, or to also practice reparative forms of knowledge and resistance, is one that Virginia Woolf faced and that we face as we devote ourselves to the study of her life and work. Revisiting Sedgwick's essay brought intriguing questions about the dominance of paranoid approaches in modernist and Woolf studies, which became apparent when I attempted to resituate this essay from the global crisis of HIV/AIDS to one that preoccupied Woolf, the violence and trauma inflicted by the emergence of total war. Total war being a ubiquitous kind of modern warfare that involves every part of society and from which civilians are not exempt or protected. Sedgwick's Paranoid Imperative brings to mind a massive body of historicist scholarship on modernism and war that explores Woolf's lucid insights into intersectional forms of violence in The Room of One's Own and Three Guineas, and how these insights play out in her fiction. I find it striking that so much less has been written on Woolf's commitment to peace building, and how such criticism often appears to be driven by a mandatory injunction to read in paranoid fashion, a critical imperative that has survived particular historical moments where it seemed like the best lens through which to approach Woolf's writing of the so-called real world. A representative Cold War account is Alex Swerling's book chapter, Pacifism Without Hope, which stresses how pacifist resistance to escalating militarization came to be seen as unsustainable once it became clear that there would be a Second World War. And the paranoid imperative remains strong in our time of geopolitical tension, as evidenced by Paul St. Amour's Tense Future from 2015, which foregrounds the contemporaneous modernist understanding of the period between the wars as being precisely interwar years. And he's also theorizing our present as inscribed in a perpetual interwar. Now, St. Amour admits that his reconstruction of historical development where total war becomes an inevitable reality is an incomplete history, in a sense. We could add that it's retrospective and sidesteps the call to piece together an alternative history of modernism's involvement in cultural and political efforts towards peace building, disarmament, and international diplomacy at a fragile time that was perceived by many as post-war. Now, this call has been heeded only very recently by growing attention to the political urgency of Woolf's pacifism and commitment to positive peace, which means creating the conditions for sustainable peace, as opposed to merely ending violence. Scholars like Ashley Foster, Jean Mills, Claire Davison, and the organizers of the 2018 Conference on Woolf, Europe and Peace have begun a transformation of the field, making paranoid reading less of an ethical imperative than one possible form of critical attention and activity. It's occurred to me that several of the contributions to this conference and the 2 volumes that came out of it read Woolf reparatively in the sense that they see ethical and political potential in Woolf's aesthetic cultivation of pleasure and joy. It's also occurred to me how much Sedgwick's words of wisdom holds true for Woolf when she writes, "It is sometimes the most paranoid tending people who are able to and need to develop and disseminate the richest reparative practices." For this lecture, I wanted to explore how Sedgwick's call for reparative literary and critical practices might help us understand Woolf's call to think peace into existence as a particularly compelling response to the realities of total war. I believe Sedgwick's theory of reparative and paranoid reading can provide some new perspectives on the politics of affect in Woolf's work, but also on her ethical thinking around security and self-preservation as jointly political and psychoanalytic categories. We can begin to unpack this by looking at her 1940 essay, Thoughts on Peace in an Air Raid, with its famous opening claims that the anxiety and fear bred by war, most intensely perhaps during an air raid, will persist as a transhistorical condition unless we can think peace into existence and thereby, she writes, create the only efficient air raid shelter. What does this mean? How can something as ephemeral as thinking detached from immediate action bring about political peace and offer better protection than air raid shelters from the exposure to harm inflicted by total war? One long answer can be pieced together from the following passage. At any moment, a bomb may fall on this very room. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The seconds pass. The bomb did not fall, but during those seconds of suspense, all thinking stopped, all feeling, save one dull dread, ceased. A nail fixed the whole being to one hard board. The emotion of hate is therefore sterile, unfertile. Directly that fear passes, the mind reaches out and instinctively revives itself, trying to create. Since the room is dark, it can only create from memory. It reaches out to the memory of other Augusts, in Bayreuth, listening to Wagner, in Rome, walking over the Campagna, in London. Friends' voices come back, scraps of poetry return. Each of those thoughts, even in memory, was far more positive, reviving, healing, and creative than the dull dread made of fear and hate. Therefore, if we are to compensate the young man for the loss of his glory and his gun, we must give him access to the creative feelings. We must make happiness. Now, dread, fear, and hate, all these make up the paranoid position as defined by Sedgwick and via Klein. Notably for Woolf, they block access to more positive affects, thereby paralyzing the mind and hampering any constructive thinking. They also generate the bleak prospect that, quote, not only this one body in this one bed, but millions of bodies yet to be born will lie in the same darkness and hear the same death rattle overhead. That is, unless peace can be thought into being through creative and especially literary and artistic activities. The passage attributes an extraordinary power to creative work. Not only is it able to heal or repair a traumatized mind, but also through such healing to help repair a world fragmented by war. I will return to how such reparative work might work, and first say a few words about how I see Woolf's writing of affect as a politically charged site. Now, by affect, I mean an expressive or aesthetic feature of the artwork that is related to its psychological appeal. Jonathan Flatley writes insightfully about modernist writers' awareness of how affect structures political developments in modernity. He writes, our most enduring and basic social formations, patriarchy, say, or capitalism itself, can only be enduring to the extent that they are woven into our emotional lives in the most fundamental way. Because our social formations work through affect, resistance to them must as well. I believe Woolf would have agreed, and part of the work of my book, Virginia Woolf and the Ethics of Intimacy, was to read her interwar writing as exploring what kinds of affects might offer productive resistance to those sustaining the modern nets of global capitalism and militarization. And I was also interested in what affective and psychological states might inspire nonviolent ethical positions and political action. I've always found particularly compelling her formalist notion that art enables us, in Roger Fry's words, to both feel an emotion and watch it. I think her writing invites us to partake in such aesthetic contemplation, which is ethical because it makes us see what political investments and motivations a particular affect inspires, rather than follow the compelling course of acting on emotions impulsively and immediately. So how can we apply this to the close relation between thinking and feeling that Woolf theorizes in Thoughts on Peace? Regarding the affects of fear and anxious anticipation, Woolf weaves them into the fabric of her argument, making us both feel and contemplate or think critically about these emotions. Her theorizing of these feelings as hampering critical thought resonates with St. Amour's research on the weaponizing of what he calls pre-traumatic stress, as a form of strategic psychological warfare in total war. So pre-traumatic stress is, he writes, a psychic wounding produced by the anticipation of violence. So kind of wounding, being traumatized in advance, as it were. And this stress works to justify militarization and imperialist wars by paralyzing civilians' critical capacity through the dissemination of fear and hate, thereby undermining the critique that militaristic securitization, as Woolf observes, makes us less, not more, safe. In Thoughts on Peace, she notes that as long as the education of young men keeps glorifying war, military victory for the Allies is likely to lead only to negative peace, another temporary cessation of violence. And in Three Guineas, as we know, she links the culture and money interests behind the war machine to the psychology enabling patriarchal, military, and imperialist aggression. Throughout her interwar writing, Woolf is alert to the ways in which violent social systems are sustained through the engineering of certain affects, and how war gains widespread acceptance as an inevitable reality because it breeds emotions like hate and fear. If we read Thoughts on Peace with Sedgwick and Klein, We could say that Woolf theorizes these emotions as responses to threats, a reader imagined, that lock subjects in a paranoid position where we can't escape seeing ourselves as vulnerable to imminent violence, and therefore can't think peace into being. We could even say that she's pointing to a ubiquitous paranoid imperative of the critical and political imagination. We should pause here and ask whether this paranoid imperative isn't best resisted through paranoid political thinking, such as that which Woolf practices in 3 Guineas. Here too, I find Sedgwick illuminating. In another essay, she sees the paranoid position as predominant and necessary in political activism, while reparative reading has richer ethical potential. And I believe Sedgwick invites us to think of a reparative ethics as a vital horizon towards which politics must strive, and to imagine the unrealized potential of such an ethics to shape political action. This is at least how I've always seen the relationship between ethics and politics in Woolf's writing. And I want to consider her more lyrical writing in particular as creating a reparative ethics, of which the guiding words might be, we must make happiness, and directly the fear passes, the mind reaches out and instinctively revives itself, trying to create. Now, the reviving, healing, and creative thoughts that come back via memory in the dark room bring to mind Melanie Klein's writing on the capacity of fantasy, as she calls it, or the infant's imagination, basically, to find comfort in conjuring the satisfaction coming from the mother's breast. For Klein, this is the first source of goodness, pleasure, love, care, and I quote Klein, a feeling of security and the satisfaction of all our self-preservative needs, even when this source is not there. Right, so for Klein, this capacity persists in imaginative and creative activities later in life, where pleasant fantasies accompany actual satisfaction. And this is part of what makes Sedgwick see in Klein an ethics that begins with, quote, care of the self, the often very fragile concern to provide the self with pleasure and nourishment in an environment that is perceived as not particularly offering it. In Thoughts on Peace, the reparative capacity by which the mind instinctively revives itself trying to create becomes the only efficient air raid shelter, I think, not primarily because it provides a constructive redirection of primal aggression through so-called sublimation. Rather, Woolf envisions here the artistic creation of alternative and more sustainable ways of providing security and self-preservation than through militarization. She develops this thought in a striking manuscript passage from the opening of Anon, which was later omitted from the manuscript. She writes, the heart of this vast proliferation of printed pages remains the song. The song has the same power over the reader in the 20th century as over the hearer in the 11th. To enjoy singing, to enjoy hearing the song must be the most deep-rooted, the toughest of human instincts, comparable for persistency with the instinct of self-preservation. It is indeed the instinct for self-preservation. The passion with which we seek out these creations and attempt endlessly, perpetually to make them is of a piece with the instinct that sets us preserving our bodies with clothes, food, roofs from destruction. The pleasure, joy, and self-protective capacity defining the song-making instinct at the heart of an archaic communal culture, Woolf sees as the vital but obscure origin of modern literature. And in this, I see a notion of artistic creation as world-making that we can relate to her idea that making happiness through literature is essential to the work of thinking peace into existence. Now, drawing here on Sedgwick's Kleinian ethics of the literary imagination and its capacity to find pleasure, the satisfaction of needs, and a sense of security in art and aesthetics, even when the external world isn't offering them. In Thoughts on Peace, Woolf suggests that this fragile self-care by which the paralyzed mind revives or repairs itself after an air raid is essential for critical and political efforts to repair a broken geopolitical system. And I think this might be one fruitful intersection between Bloomsbury's artistic and political work for disarmament, decolonization, socioeconomic equality, and international cooperation. We can infer that from Woolf's perspective, the group's future-oriented reparative commitment to rebuild European civilization on firmer ground and more lastingly, in Christine Frullau's words, must begin with happiness as indispensable to the critical capacity to imagine a world and social systems that are good, nourishing, caring, and protective of human well-being, not as an impossible or unrealistic utopia, but as a creative and imaginative process that is necessary for the building of positive or sustainable peace. And there is a growing body of scholarship on the critical and aesthetic affordances of the concept of reparation. In the past 10 years, scholars from different disciplines have observed that the reparative capacity of things like art and literature should not be conflated with conservative restoration, as it often was in the Kleinian turn in literary studies at the time Sedgwick wrote her essay. Sedgwick stresses that to make whole again is not necessarily to recreate any idealized or pre-existing whole. And the editor of a recent journal issue on ethical aesthetic repairs points out that repair is both to have recourse to and make ready, invoking the potential for transformation and creative addition that can render something operative in new ways. A section on infrastructures of care of infrastructures in this journal issue posits that if the entities that undergo repairs are seen as existing in relational webs of entanglement rather than as discrete objects, then a repair to one entity in this web may simultaneously enact a repair to several connected entities. Now, crucially, this form of reparation makes visible the whole system, including its flaws, in ways that weren't possible when the system was perceived to be running smoothly. If Woolf's writing raises awareness about the ways in which libidinal attachments enmesh modern subjects in the webs and infrastructures of modernity, as Maud Ellman observes, it seems fair to speculate that her literary cultivation of certain affects and psychological states inspires a form of self-repair that may well inspire reparative social political action. When Woolf writes that thinking peace into existence must begin through access to the creative feelings, she articulates an insight that Sedgwick finds in Klein, that affects motivate human thought and action at least as much as the drives, possibly more so, and that affects should not be reduced to mere manifestations of the drives. Now, even a Freudian novel like Between the Acts creates a range of subtle affects that undoes Freud's deadlock, where civilization amounts to a constant struggle between libidinal and destructive drives, of which the emotional manifestations are, well, only love and hate. So what feelings are creative in this motivational and performative way for Woolf, and wherein lies their ethical potential? I will end this lecture with considering peace as an emotion, following the anonymous voice that modifies Isa Oliver's bleak notion of a love-hate polarity. Love and hate, how they tore her asunder. The anonymous voice then says, peace was the third emotion. Love, hate, peace, three emotions made apply of human life. If we follow the dictionary definition, where peace denotes freedom from anxiety, disturbance, emotional, mental, or spiritual, or inner conflict, calm, tranquility, we might read Woolf as saying in Thoughts on Peace that art and literature can help build peace in the sense of amity and concord between individuals and nations by giving access to inner peace in this affective sense. I should say momentary access. For Woolf, as for Klein and Sedgwick, the fragile anxiety mitigating achievement of reparation is ethical only insofar as it comes out of anxiety, but not the anxiety for oneself at the expense of others that defines the paranoid position, where the only available roles are those of aggressive destroyer and vulnerable victim. And a moral regime is that of an archaic eye for an eye kind. The Kleinian depressive position that enables reparation comes out of anxiety for the other, recognizing one's implication in systemic violence that puts the life of others at risk, inspires the capacity to identify with others, care for and do good to them. Now, in my essay that came out of the Woolf European Peace Conference, Peace as Awakeness to the Precariousness of the Other, Virginia Woolf's Pacifist Ethics, I read Thoughts on Peace as eliciting anxiety for the vulnerable other rather than oneself in a Levinasian ethics of love, peace, and proximity that I see Woolf as advocating in 3 Guineas. But today, I've explored the possibility of an alternative Woolfian ethics in which the emotion of inner peace or tranquility that literature can provide enables a pleasurable form of self-care that is vital to the capacity to care for others and imagine caring social and geopolitical systems protective of human well-being. For Woolf and Klein, the reparative capacity of art offers a momentary relief from anxiety, which, if intense and constant, hampers the desire for knowledge and its access in blocking the spectrum of ways of thinking and feeling that the paranoid imperative disavows. This, I think, is illustrated repeatedly in what I see as one of Woolf's most reparative texts, To the Lighthouse, a work textured to a great extent by Mr. Ramsay's paranoid position. But it won't be fine. His own children should be aware from childhood that life is difficult, facts uncompromising. In a striking passage, this paranoid position makes Mr. Ramsay slur over, this is Woolf's words, and deprecate comfort, happiness, pleasure, and beauty. Now, Mrs. Ramsay, precariously giving these repetitive things to her child James, along with bliss, joy, and hope. Yes, of course it'll be fine, if it's fine tomorrow. Says, yes, of course we'll go to the lighthouse, right, if it's fine tomorrow. She nonetheless feels, and this is the first quotation here, this thing that she called life, terrible, hostile, and quick to pounce on you if you gave it a chance. They were the eternal problems, suffering, death, the poor. When she experiences a moment of ecstatic bliss, feeling that she's becoming one with the lighthouse light, when life sank down for a moment, the range of experience seemed limitless. There rose to her lips some exclamation of triumph over life, when things came together in this peace, this rest, this eternity. Now, I don't think we should read this triumph as one of art or creative pleasure over life in the sense of socio-political realities, but as a momentary respite from a life overshadowed by the paranoid imperative, and a moment of inner rest and peace, which enables a wider range of synthesized thought and feeling. And we can see this in a passage depicting Lily Briscoe and William Banks' view of the sea as a stroll down through the garden. They came there regularly every evening, drawn by some need. It was as if the water floated off and set sailing thoughts which had grown stagnant on dry land and gave to the bodies even some sort of physical relief. In Virginia Woolf and the Ethics of Intimacy, I read such moments of blissful return to pre-subjective states in which I cannot be distinguished from the other and outside, as the pleasurable avant-garde practice of intimate revolt theorized by Julia Kristeva. It's a mode of writing that combines intimacy, which Kristeva defines as a reuniting with affect through the poetic exploration of individual psychic life. Combining then intimacy with revolts, which for Kristeva is not necessarily in the sense of transgression, where it is transgression, but it is also thought as return, going in quest of oneself. And this practice is ethical because it suspends the temporality of systemic violence and the subject's autonomy and self-interest. There's a Levinasian strand in this thinking, right? So thereby enabling the subjects to question these as inevitable realities that must structure interpersonal and geopolitical relations. Such an ethics of intimacy would be in line with the Kleinian ethics, where, and cite Klein here, security attained by satisfaction of our essential requirements, and I've added here first afforded by the mother, such security is linked up with emotional security. This is food for thought that Woolf gives us. The vital capacity to imagine security provided through the satisfaction of human needs rather than through militarization. And as Woolf suggests into The Lighthouse and Thoughts on Peace, this constructive and reparative imagination amounts to being at peace with ourselves, as Klein puts it when she writes that a good relation to ourselves is a condition for love, tolerance, and wisdom towards others. In this sense, the capacity for reparative reading of literature and the world at large is a precondition for the desire to, in Klein's words, contribute to the pleasure, comfort, or happiness of other people. Thank you all so much for your attention, and I look forward to discussing any thoughts and questions you might have. And I'm also happy to share this presentation. Just get in touch with me via email if you would like that. So I'll stop sharing my PowerPoint.
Wow, that was really, that was wonderful, Elsa. Thank you so much. I hope you can see everyone clapping. If you would like to, I'll open things up for a conversation. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the reactions button, which is the little smiley face, and you can raise your hand in there if you'd like to. And you'll go to the top of the screen if you do that. For myself, Elsa, maybe I'll start us off. I found your talk very moving. I actually had to clean up my face, make sure I didn't have too many tears. Especially your readings of when you were drawing our attention to specific words and lines in Thoughts on Peace in an Air Raid. I just really enjoyed it. And I really found helpful when you discussed pre-traumatic stress. And I wondered if that was a very interesting and sort of dense concept. And I wondered if you might talk for a moment about, you elaborated certain things that it kind of causes or brings into existence. And I wondered if you might talk a moment about that.
The things that pre-traumatic stress brings into existence,
Yeah,
the kind of political landscape.
Yeah.
It engenders, yes. Yes, I mean, Paul Sintemore, when he theorizes pre-traumatic stress, this is his conception from Tense Future, which I think was awarded the MSA book prize back then. It's a very compelling book. But I having reread Sedgwick, I read it very much as written in the paranoid vein. And I mean, Sedgwick would be the first to acknowledge that we do need a paranoid reading practices. I mean, what's the use of thinking away trauma, anxiety, etc. But so he engages partly with Sedgwick. Sorry, I think that's not quite right. The pre-traumatic stress. I've been having this conversation with. I don't know if Claire Davison is with us. She was with us here at Uppsala University in November and December through a grant funded by the Uppsala Forum on Democracy, Peace and Justice, and she gave a wonderful talk on peace building work, radio broadcasting, etc., in the so-called interwar years. And we spoke a lot about then about historicizing modernism, and when you historicize the modernist moment as inevitably as being interwar already for the modernists themselves, that this is something that the weaponizing of pre-traumatic stress would have produced, the sense that that's already in the so-called in the Roaring 20s. We're headed inevitably towards the Second War, and even if this turned out to happen, we had a Second World War, we had a Cold War. Now we're heading into a new age of authoritarian far-right politics, etc. New forms of fascism. I think there's more value than ever in also doing this work that Claire and so many of you have been doing. Ashley Foster, I'm not sure if she's here, and others. There's also the need to, if you want to historicize from within this moment, the so-called interwar years, that you also then keep in mind that for many people writing then, this was post-war, as Claire keeps on saying, this was post-war, and nobody really knew. It was a precarious, but there were massive efforts, political efforts and cultural efforts towards peace building, and etc. So yes, I think there's something partly for us as critics, the way we historicize and think of modernism, where we locate the relevance, the contemporary relevance of modernism primarily in how this was the beginning of pre-traumatic stress. This was a moment that was interwar, that is now extended indefinitely into the future, because this is where we found ourselves too. The value, as Sedgwick puts it, in also imagining alternative courses of history, where there was a war, there was another war, etc. But we need. So I think pre-traumatic stress is something, and Saint Amour talks about how he himself, he can't de-stress, as it were. He writes about how he is caught up in this, in what he historicizes essentially, but which he finds. Sorry, I think it was a long answer, but maybe your question was more about what it does to the contemporary political landscape rather than to our work as critics, Amy. Maybe I didn't get you right there.
No, I found your answer really helpful. I don't know if it was a good question, but it sounds like you're saying that in some ways you disagree with Saint Amour. You would like us to maybe add something that is not focused on reading the modernists as in pre-traumatic stress mode. I for some reason I can't see you anymore. I don't know why. Yeah, thank you, Elsa.
Right, thank you.
I don't know who was first, Madeline or Ben.
I think Madeline was.
Okay.
Thanks, Ben. Elsa, that was lovely. I appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, yes. I can't see
Okay,
myself
good.
now. I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's hard to be together but so apart. I just want to say that. I really enjoyed your talk, and I think it's right on. And I've been teaching Woolf during this particular time period, and now in this sort of hideous historical moment. And I've been having some resistance to reading reparatively and reading anything reparatively. You know, I did a course on fascism, and folks are like, no, we must, you know, there's a way in which reparative reading is seen as capitulation, which I don't see. But I'm wondering if we could think about, you know, marshaling arguments against that view that if you don't, you know, sort of, you know, fight fascism, for example, with militarization, with aggressive sort of resistance, that you're somehow, you know, capitulating. And it seems to me that in your reading of Thoughts on Peace in an Air Raid, you were getting to that in sense that not just peace, but love also might be some kind of a way to counter fascist emotions. Hopefully that makes sense as a question.
Yes, definitely. And there's been massive resistance to the idea of reparation. And yes, but I think we need to be careful to distinguish between ethics and politics, where I've never seen them as operating on the same plane. I think, for example, somebody like Judith Butler sometimes assumes that an ethics based on, okay, we recognize that we're all precarious lives, being human is to be vulnerable to violence, etc. That's the recognition and sort of responsibility for the ways in which we're always in the hands of others, always to be dependent on others, and, you know, the world's resources, what have you, right? That this will somehow lead to better political systems. I think, I mean, I've used Butler a lot in my work on Virginia Woolf as well, but I've got my quibbles with her in that sense, in the kind of the sense of a sort of smooth bridging between ethics and politics. I think, yes, for political responses, I think we need a paranoid thinking, and Ashley Foster's got this wonderful chapter on the intersectional pacifisms of the Bloomsbury group. I think it's in the Bloomsbury handbook, of the Bloomsbury group. About Leonard Woolf, for example, if you extend the concept of pacifism beyond the kind of absolute pacifism, saying that no violence is never justified, to saying in the Spanish Civil War, etc., during the Second World War, facing the mass slaughter of civilians, that sometimes military intervention is needed. I think we can keep both thoughts in our head at the same time, that might be needed in terms of political responsiveness and action. But to then go on to build more sustainable societies that actually care about, you know, human well-being as opposed to making life as miserable as possible for so many people across the planet. Right, we need, I think that's where reparative reading and reparative, cultivating reparative affects and psychological mental states actually plays a role. So positive peace, I like that idea of positive peace as being that we need to bring into existence the socioeconomic conditions, or gender equality, all kinds of things that eliminate the roots and causes of war and conflict. And I would like to think of psychological and affective states, if you will, as that this could be part of, or probably has probably been theorized also as part of the work of positive peace. And this is for me the realm of the literary, or Virginia Woolf's more lyrical fiction in particular. Does that make sense? It was a long answer.
No, it makes sense. What you're advocating is a kind of pragmatic reparative stance, right? Pragmatic insofar as you still have to do the work, in the political sphere of resisting, and that might not be as might be different from the ethical. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the ethical being Jessica Berman's wonderful book on modernist commitments and ethics, where she talks about ethics as being the realm of what ought to be, and what it just we don't have it isn't now, but it ought to be. That's the realm of ethics. Well, what is the kind of politics we had, political systems we got. And I think, if we imagine with Klein a kind of nurturing, the source of where you could take the matter, you could apply that to our natural resources, our groundwater, the things we need to thrive, the things on which we're dependent. Hey, William, I'm just saying goodnight to my 4-year-old. Sorry, who's going to bed. This is now the evening in Sweden. Okay, William, good night. So gott. Okay, sorry. Okay, so yes, and that this reparative imagination, imagining the external world as nurturing, as good, etc. That it's a crucial a crucial act of the imagination that I think might be vital for any vision of sustainable peace, positive peace. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Ben, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And Elsa, it's good to see you and to hear from you again. Thank you for this beautiful, beautiful lecture. I was very excited to hear that you had accepted Amy's offer to deliver this talk. I may have a simple or complex question, because I may have follow-up questions, which we can get into another time, depending on the answer. If I heard you right, and you can maybe this will just be a corrective answer. You described Three Guineas as a paranoid project. Am I right about that? And I was wondering if I'm right about that, if you could elaborate a little bit. So that's part one, elaborate a little bit. And then part two, this stems from the answer to Mad's question. If it's important, and I agree with you that it is, to keep and to distinguish politics and ethics, if they operate on different planes, does that rule out the possibility that politics and ethics still occasionally sort of, I don't know the right verb to use, that isn't violent, but bleed into each other, maybe cooperate, or in some sense are acting at the same time in some sense to different ends? And so that's maybe part two of the question. So part one, just the clarification about Three Guineas, and then part two, is it the case that they're on completely different planes, or do they occasionally sort of interleave?
Yeah. Right. Okay, so Three Guineas, I was basically thinking about the way she's theorizing these imbricating intersectional forms of violence, the way fascism abroad begins at home in the patriarchal family, etc. The structures of patriarchy, fascism, imperialism, etc., capitalism, capitalist exploitation, and the greed, how does she put it, claiming, other people's lands and goods and etc. Anyway, that there was that paranoid strand that I see in it. But did you tell me do you think of it primarily as a reparative text, Three Guineas? I mean, it is both, as I think Woolf's writing is
Yes. Okay. So I guess that is what I was wondering, if to some degree there's also, I mean, because I often think of Three Guineas also as an ethical treatise, much in the way that you were describing at the same time. And so I guess my basic sort of follow-up question to that would be, is that your sense of how that text operates, and are both of these things sort of operating together in that text and in Woolf's thinking? So
yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I don't think ethics is by any sort of given definition reparative, or intrinsically reparative. I mean, you have reparative ethics, you have paranoid ethics, etc. And then you've got many different ethical strands in three. It also depends, and we talk about ethics, it depends on what line of ethics we really. I'm talking from my own previous work on a very much inspired by Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, and the post-Levinasian theory, Judith Butler, Lucia Regueret, Julia Kristeva, etc. And my work on that I wrote for Derek and Peter's volume on and the ethics, where Woolf says in Three Guineas we must distinguish between the law and the laws. And I mean, Madeline, you've got a wonderful piece on the it's not my nature to join in hating but in loving, that she takes from Antigone, and the Antigone is watching over the vulnerable body of her brother, who's buried and unburied. That this is the bit, but this is basically about anxiety for the other over oneself, as I read it in that piece that I wrote. Anyway, so for me that is more of in a paranoid vein. It's driven by deep anxiety, but in a sense of also care. Anxiety for Levinas, care for the other, putting the other, the needs of the other. Before your own needs, in a way. I mean, that the subject is called into being only in the ethical encounter with the other, whose unicity, the unique inner life, etc., must be protected and preserved. So it's about the kind of vigilant anxiety for the other over oneself. That's how I read Thoughts and Peace. You can read that in that sense too. That this is not the bomb may fall on this very room. No, it won't. It won't. Russia won't come to Sweden, at least not right away. This is rather that the text creates a kind of a textual face of the vulnerable other, the way I read it there. That anyway. So that for But of course, since insofar as there's an ethics of care embedded in that, ethics of responsibility for the vulnerable other, I think that's also reparative. Yeah. So I don't want to be too categorical and say this is reparative, this is. But the question about ethics and politics operating on the same plane, out there in the world and in the literary text, they're always implicated. But I think I find Jessica Berman's definition of what is as the realm of politics, what we have, the political systems we got. What ought to be, and that leap of the imagination into the kind of societies we'd like to have as the realm of ethics. But you don't seem entirely persuaded.
No, I'm very persuaded by much of it, but absolutely. But I guess I just wanted to hear not just if you saw ethics operative in Three Guineas, but something resembling reparation as a kind of movement from a worry about murderous part objects to the formation of something which Woolf calls some kind of whole in other places, because it seems to me that's the project of the outsider society, is very much how to take conditions that are absolutely murderous and sort of trying to imagine and form them into a whole that can be nourishing. So I'm just kind of curious about that. But you answered that beautifully, and no, I am very persuaded by your argument.
Okay.
Thank you, Ben. That's a great question. Ashley, would you like to go next?
Hi, thank you so much for such a lovely talk. And I really appreciate your introducing Sedgwick into this conversation and the entire connection between repair and healing. You invoked pulsing a more intense future, and there's this line, the past could have been other than what it was, intense future. And thinking about Jessica Berman's like what ought to be, I've been thinking a lot lately about what might have been, and it's been a really long time since I've looked at Sedgwick, but I'm curious, in the motif of repair, how do we read revision into that? What's the relationship between repair and revision in that healing?
So could you just elaborate, what do you mean by revision in this sense? It's not about literary revision, it's about
Historical revision, or thinking about the futures that never actually manifested. If we go back to Saint Amour, right? Like the futures that could have been in the past that people were working towards, but the roads we never actually went down, right? Because the historical trajectory took us somewhere else. And how do we come to terms in our own minds with that kind of possible revision? And how does that work with repair and healing? Or is revision a motif of repair? I guess might even be a good starting point.
So now you're talking from our perspective as critics when we piece together the history of modernism, for example. That's the work Saint Amour is doing, and that he's very interested in that as well. Like Sedgwick, they overlap on the what could have been. The author history did not necessarily need to take this course. Yes. Oh goodness. Yeah, it's a difficult question. It's one that I haven't thought about. Revision. But you're not thinking revision as in reparation in another ethical sense of the agent responsible for harm, damage, violence, the responsibility to compensate for, undo the damage of the past. That's not what you have in mind when you talk about revision. You mean more when we pursue, for example, if we historicize from within the moment of the Versailles peace and the years following that we really explore also the peace building projects, etc. The work that we're doing, that Claire is doing. I'm sorry, I think I can't quite wrap my head around the question.
Sorry, it may be really abstract, and there could be something in the revision about the revision of, if we think about violence and what you just discussed with the perpetrator and the victim, a revision about the way that the narrative is told, but that's not what I was thinking of immediately. It was more like the echoes of the lives not led and the futures not pursued. So that moment of hope in the 1930s, right? Like 1934 is this pivotal moment. And we have, one of the world's largest peace movements ever. And it seemed like disarmament was possible. And even though Hitler was maintaining, traction, there was this kind of global hope. And that hope, I don't know, in some ideas in my mind kind of creates its own trajectory that then was never lived, right? And so is there a revision process in the repair that allows us to dwell within that space? And I haven't looked at Sedgwick for a long time, so maybe it's not even an appropriate question. So sorry, but it just, as you were talking, I was thinking about repair, and then revision came into mind. And I didn't even know if that was part of it.
I love that idea. It's something I've never thought of in theoretical terms. Because I was a bit at a loss when you asked me, but I really like what you said there. And what came to mind, something I couldn't fit into my talk, but I wanted to, was a sketch of the past, where Woolf talks about the echoes of past emotions. And this is, of course, just bringing this in line more with my talk now, where she says, I feel that strong emotion must leave its trace, and it's only a question of discovering how we can get ourselves again attached to it. Where she has this radiophonic moment where she imagines you can just plug something into the wall and sort of listen back into the past, where she's in her very first years of life, she's got this intensely pleasurable experience of some form of bliss, lying awake in the evening, etc. at St. Ives. And so that's the closest I can get when I'm just brainstorming right now about revision and the kind of echoes of the past. But this is then something that was actually in her past. But it occurred to me something about this emotion that was once in existence, of being held, being cared for, being safe, secure, all your needs met, being nourished, etc., well fed. that retaining that emotion is something that still exists, the echoes or the actual emotion itself, that if you can well, bringing this back through art, which I think is what Woolf is doing to a great extent when she plunges into these pre-subjective formational moments where the self is not this construct of absolute autonomy, the modern I, etc. But there's something, yeah. But I'm sure there's much more to this. I would love to hear more about, you know, what you find as you keep on working. How is your? Yeah. Okay, great. I wish we were here and we could talk in person.
I know. I wish we had a coffee hour and we could take this conversation out into the hallway. Thank you so much. It was such a beautiful talk, and
Okay.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your response, Ashley. It's really appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. We've had some interesting talk in the chat about people's, well, some people responding to what we're talking about with Sedgwick and revision, but also before that, Shiloh was talking about your just the way that you made her think about sort of solving a problem. So yeah, Jane, thanks for raising your hand. I think you're muted.
Elsa, thank you. That was such a wonderful and much needed intervention, I think, on ethics at this point. And I too found what you were saying very moving. I just want to just quickly look at my note. I liked the way that you clarified the differences that we must bear in mind between planes of politics and the planes of ethics. I want to draw your attention back to what you're saying about affect. And I think you're taking this from Saint-Amour, this idea of the engineering of affect, which is open to us all as a kind of political tool. Is it in the plane of politics that the engineering of affect occurs? And secondly, how does the engineering of affect align or otherwise with the notion of the manufacture of political consent? I'm thinking particularly of that, the way in which you very carefully laid out this kind of, you could argue that Mr. Ramsey is the kind of avatar of paranoid thinking, and Mrs. Ramsey is the reparative force, particularly in the opening scenes. But her nourishment, and this is where I think the queerness of Sedgwick's idea of the reparative needs to be brought out. That here we've got this primary scene of compulsory heterosexuality, and you have the mother being the nurturing, if you like, politically collaborative, dangerously so, in that she's nurturing somebody who's going to, in her mind, preside over the judicial system and the administration of imperial and colonial violence. So, you know, I wonder if you could tell me what you think, because, you know, engineering affects is something, yes, we must manufacture happiness, and I celebrate that with Woolf, but it's not as if you know, with my paranoid hat on, that I don't understand how that gets weaponized by the warmongers. Does that make sense to you? I just, you know, that the manufacture of consent doesn't come through violence. It goes back to what you're talking about, I think, with the idea of pre-traumatic stress, what keeps people obeying what is ultimately a violent system is the threat of violence, not violence itself.
Yes.
So would you care to comment on that? It's a kind of overlap between ethics and politics, but I think what's in the middle of what I'm trying to say is this function of the engineering of affects, which is happening to us as we're reading Woolf, exploring these primal themes.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that clarification. I agree that it's not, I mean, at least not here where I am right now in Sweden. It's not the engineering of certain affects will be more geared towards creating political consent about highly contestable problems like our NATO membership, for example. I don't know if you've been following the report here, but this is clear. There is a sense in which the specter of Russia will invade, etc., has brought about now pushed us into NATO membership even after 200 years of non-alignment. Even if, okay, we've been collaborating, etc., we've been practicing with NATO and so forth, but for many still it came like that. This was a bit of a shock that the government took this step without a referendum, without really consulting. I think there are about half 50-50 sort of support, 50-50 against. But I wanted to say that I think the spectre of, Russia will invade, I don't think that is primarily what has increased support for NATO. I think it's more cynical than that, more sort of money interest based. That this is the Swedish weapons industry has a great interest in this, and there will be this worry that, well, economically will be at a real disadvantage if we don't join now that Finland is joining, etc. And I actually, I don't know what is really what, if it's the spectre of threat, etc., the violence that is really more at work in engineering certain affects like fear, say fear, dread, to take the thoughts from,
or even the reparative act of thinking of the other, thinking of the refugee, the political decisions about feelings of hospitality towards those who've been violated. In Britain, our government is offering £800 a month to people who take in refugees from Ukraine, but people of a different skin color who wash up on our coasts after the most brutal passages over the Channel are being shipped off to Rwanda. So there's a kind of mobilizing of affect to manufacture political consent. And I suppose I'm in agreement with you that Woolf is kind of giving us the tools to think through that, and that you brought out the kind of ethical position of this in the encounter in Mr. Ramsey and Mrs. Ramsey, for example, and pointing up this third possibility of peace as an emotion. I don't think Woolf necessarily offers us an answer, but I suspect it may lie in rethinking heteronormativity and embracing what Cedric's saying about queerness, about what is it about queer relations that builds different kinds of, manufactures different kinds of affect.
Yes, absolutely. And this was outside of the realm of my own talk, but a lot of the interest in reparation and repair over the past 10 years has been indeed because of Sedgwick's theorizing of this in terms of queer politics. Yes, and I know I basically agree with what you're saying. I don't think I don't think they're necessarily different stances. I don't think it's wrong to expand the framework of violence, the dread and the fear of the virus, the HIV virus, etc., the way it was spread, and to extend that and think about other violent systems, whether these be racism, war as a system that makes human life into commodifies or like human lives, bodies as resources to be expended with, as used for the war effort, etc. I think Sedgwick herself she's taking, yes, definitely this is based in, are you thinking more in terms of doing things otherwise as a queer, as something that needs to be acknowledged as a particular queer?
Well, in the Paranoid and Reparative essay itself, Woolf's Sedgwick's primary example is queer, queer culture, and she takes to task Butler for not for only the invocation of Butler takes us only so far in unmasking gender performance as something that any queer text might be seen to demonstrate. But then she asks, what else in any text are we therefore blind to? And particularly with queer, there's a whole list of things that queer does in terms of the accretive.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. At the end, where she's talking about camp and as being driven by love and all these features of camp, fighting and etc. That could be Orlando, right? I mean, that's I think Madeline and I actually came across a piece you wrote for a short piece on Madeline Detlef's written a lovely piece on the Camp Orlando with Sedgwick. But I definitely think that this description in this particular essay of the accretion, the antiquarian impulse, the sort of the ludicrous, everything just. So
I don't want to kind of hog the conversation, but it was just that idea that the model from Clark, the nurturing mother and baby, and the way in which all of that can so easily become a kind of heteronormative narrative about.
And I didn't want to overemphasize the mother. It was not Mrs. Ramsey because she's Mrs. Ramsey, the mother of James. There was more. What I've been interested in, the book I wrote also on intimacy is sort of the very first forms of intimacy where the infants can't separate themselves entirely from the mother's body, etc. That these moments of jouissance, bliss, etc. in her writing, how they transport us, or I don't know if they transport us, but it's a really experience also of the pleasure of the text in that sense of a kind of that I read in that book as also being reparative and also serving ethics of a non-violent ethics. But yes, I mean, I totally take your point aboard, and we shouldn't, even if I resituate Sedgwick's essay, I have to.
So just to make it thank you.
You're quite right, yeah.
And I hope to read more. I mean, what direction is your work on ethics going next? You've given us such a rich model for going forward. What are you hoping to do next with your
the question with my research?
On ethics?
I'm not sure. I've got a project on ethics as such. This was more of a one of the performance I did for now, based on my old work, but also thinking it's in line with my current work on the affective. The politics of affective transmission in literary modernism. There's this wonderful book, Teresa Brennan, on the transmission of affect as being something that's taken for granted in pre-modern societies, but with modernity, the idea that affect is not just our own, but that it got pathologized, etc., as group psychology is something dangerous for with Freud and so forth. There's a lot of on affective transmission. I think Catherine Mansfield politicizes it definitely. So I'm working on that. There's an ethical strand in that, but otherwise I'm interested in, I've got a project I applied for funding for, which we'll see if I get, called Fragile Modernism, where I'm interested in the idea of the fragile features of modernist writing as evidencing various forms of engagement with fragile progressive social-political formations like the League of Nations, the welfare state, etc. So moving away from vulnerability towards the fragile as something that's worthy of protection, worthy of protection from damage, etc. But where vulnerability, I've come to think more and more, is inevitably it becomes about trying to securitize ourselves against threats. And there's something, if you think paranoid versus reparative, I think maybe it's sketchy anyway, but I've come to think that vulnerability, in however you use it, the term, and especially now by the far right, it becomes very much geared towards a paranoid mindset in politics. Anyway, okay.
Thank you. Just such lovely crystalline phrases that you're leaving us with, like affect is not any single person's, it's not ours alone. I think it's very, very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And thank you, Elsa. I don't know if there's anyone else who'd like to make a comment. I would like to say that in about 12 minutes, we have a break, which is also not a break. If you wish it to be a break, it may be, but from 2:30 to 3 Eastern time, we're going to have during that break a conversation with reproductive rights activists in Texas, talking about their work. And I'd love to have as many people as are interested in joining that conversation be there with us. So that'll be in about 10 minutes. So yeah, is there anything else anyone would like to say before we end? It's been a really interesting, fascinating conversation. Yeah. Thank you so much, Elsa, for starting off the conference with a real bang, a nonviolent bang, more of a ploof. This has been a very moving and intellectually rigorous, fascinating conversation. It's given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm really grateful that you have helped us start things off right. Looks like everyone's very happy with it. So I'll stop talking.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Elsa.
Thanks, everyone, for your feedback as well. Right, looking forward to seeing you in person, hopefully.
Yes.
Here in a few years from now.
Yes.
Okay.
Us too. Jane, I see that you've made a comment in the chat. If you want to, if you'd like to speak, you may, Jane DeGay.
Sorry, you've probably just closed the conversation now, but it was just about, I was interested, that wonderful quotation, thoughts of peace in the air raids, and you were talking about that sort of passing of that moment of the pre-traumatic stress. And then she turns to think about poetry, she turns to think about opera, and what role culture plays in that reparative process. And then also think about between the acts, when of course the play, is the play part of that reparative process? Yeah, so just offering some thoughts there.
Oh yes, thank you, Jane. Yes, I mean, yeah, for Klein, creative work as in art, literature, but any constructive activities really, or reparative, she's very broad constructive activities, but yes, oh goodness, the opera, yeah, I would have to think about that. But between the acts, the pageants, yeah. Between the acts, I would need to think more about the pageant and that particular novel. I haven't really made up my mind whether I see it primarily as reparative or
that fear that Giles has got of the air, the bombs are going to drop here, and then of course you've got the pageant being performed talking about culture. So two interesting contrasts there, which seem to pick up on what you were talking about.
sorry, I'm trying to read your, I'm reading your comment in the chat, but yes, sorry, could you repeat the question? I missed the bit about.
Yeah, I think what Amy's elaborating on there about the communal experience of cultural events.
The communal experience. Yes.
You know,
Yes.
there's a communal thing, but it's also
Yeah,
celebration
oh, yes,
of
of
art and
course.
culture and literature.
Yeah.
That could be reparative in contrast to their fears that everything, you know, that the war is about to arrive.
I think Jane Ellen Harrison's work is wonderful to go to. They have the ancient art and ritual and the ritual origins of art. I know there's been a lot of scholarship, feminist scholarship, and the communal practices before art became art, where we had doing as opposed to being a spectator watching. Theory also comes from being a spectator, watching tragedy, watching violence, watching etc. And as Woolf writes later in, is it Anon or the Reader, we're watching the spectacle of melancholy. We don't feel it, we don't partake in it. Everybody shared in the emotion of Anon's song, right? But I think there's something there, perhaps in between in the pageant that's being recreated. I've got a piece I'm trying to complete on the intimate and the primeval, and also the archaic communal artists as world making, where she says we are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself, as something that is done in common, and then also the communal thinking that can be, I'm sure, reparative. I'm not sure to what extent it is reparative in between. What's sufficiently problematic. It's probably but the feeling in common that can take us beyond Freud's notion of contagion, group psychology, feeling together, feeling in common through doing a creative performance together, that is inevitably becomes fascist or group. I mean, I think Sedgwick has made me think more about the reparative potential of culture and art as something that.
Great, thank you so much. I didn't mean to sort of make you answer one more question. It's been marvelous. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that question. No, I have to think more about it. I'm afraid it was only a partial answer, but I appreciate it.
It was great, and thank you for bringing it up, Jane. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm going to go over to the other session. So I'll see you all over there. Thanks so much, Elsa. It's great. I'll be in touch with you. Okay.
Yes, be in touch. I'm just reading the chat.
Elsa, in case you don't get to it in the chat and you're scrolling up, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your talk today, and you are bringing sort of paranoid and reparative, into conversation with each other as continuous processes in Woolf's writing. Shook something loose for me that's been stuck for a really long time. And I had one of those moments today while you were talking where I was like, oh, wait. And that's sort of thinking about pastoral and Woolf, and as related, these sort of pastoral and anti-pastoral impulses, particularly in the Years and Three Guineas. And as you were talking today, I've been trying to figure out how to square them. And I realized I don't have to. And it was just really marvelous. Thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed. Okay. Right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Will the chat comments be saved somehow? I haven't had a chance to read them all.
Yes.
If you see the three dots in the bottom right hand corner of the chat box, if you click on that, it should save the chat for you as a text file.
Yes, thank you. I didn't know that, even if I've taught them so much. It'd be nice to read them. So later. What you see people's feedback. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Look forward to seeing you in the rest of the conference. See you all soon.
Looking forward.